seen a lot of things going on, the Jagmeet Singh thing, a lot of confusion, about whether we support protests, not protests, what's an appropriate to protest, how do you do it right, how do you do it wrong? Well, I feel that we're doing it the wrong way quite often. I'll offer some my life experience of protests and perhaps how to help things be effective as well. I want to clear the air on some misinformation going on about in the land of social media. That being the one, somebody was tweeting about that the other day, that I drove into a bunch of protesters with a pickup truck. Now, in light of the horrific murder of protesters by a lunatic driving into protesters in Charlottesville years ago, I'd better clarify what I did in 2011 anyways. And rest assured, it was nothing dangerous or threatening. So some people might remember the series of protests across North America called Occupy back in 2011. There were copycat protests of Occupy Wall Street, where leftist protesters took over a park in New York City and set up camp in a general protest against capitalism. Support protests and marches were held across North America and held in cities, and that's fine. The problem came when groups of people set up encampments in city parks all over North America. Now, cities tolerated the encampments for a couple of weeks, but as they dragged on, it was evident there was no realistic end game for these protests, and something had to be done. Their demands were disparate and impossible to fulfill, and that's one of the problems I'm going to get to with ineffective protesting. So some of their demands are things like, we want a Canada where the debt per capita does not double in the next decade. Okay, sounds nice, but how do you negotiate that? We want a Canada where our system of exchange no longer embodies the logic of a cancer cell. These were literal demands made by people squatting in Calgary's park and protesting. And this list of demands would change daily too, as they changed leaders almost daily in these squatter camps. So as the weeks of squatting in parks dragged into months, cities across North America were forced to get injunctions and have police remove these protesters. The camps had become filthy, overdoses were becoming common, and sexual assaults were even happening. It sounded much like the Chaz zone in Seattle during the BLM protests. The mess just couldn't continue. Now, while most of the cities in North America had gotten rid of their Occupy squatters, getting into November and such, Calgary's mayor was reticent. He didn't want to have those protesters removed, despite damage being caused to Olympic Plaza and legitimate events being canceled and the safety issues that were going on. You see, these lefties were part of his support base, and he was relatively recently elected at that time. He was hoping the cold weather would take care of them before he had to act. Well, he was wrong. They weren't going anywhere. So I started a petition demanding City Hall act. And in the petition, it noted in the preamble that taxpayers would be fined if they don't shovel their sidewalk within 24 hours of a snowfall, but you can apparently squat in perpetuity in a city park. The petition gained some steam, and soon it had thousands of signatures. It was going to be presented to City Council by my then City Councilor to the rest of them in City Hall the next Monday morning. On that Friday, though, Mayor Nenshi told the press that my petition was a waste of time. He said that the charter prevented the squatters from any enforcement, and it was impossible to physically remove somebody based on a bylaw violation anyway. So he said I was basically pissing in the wind, and the case was closed, and we just have to let these guys tire out and leave on their own. So, I decided, well, let's put this to the test. So I went and checked out the park, and I noticed a service road that entered the park. It was designed for maintenance, and it was easy to access and wide open. So on the Sunday morning, I took my pickup truck, drove down the service road into the park, and put my truck in the park. Poured a coffee. I was nowhere near any of the tents, as they'd set up out in the grass, and I remained on the pavement, or the service area. So again, that rumor that I was driving into or putting protesters at risk, nothing of the sort. And few of those squatters were even out of bed yet. Now, I'd prepared some signs with ludicrous demands and screwed them to the box liner of my truck. I demanded an end to marmot tickling and the return of the TV series Arrested Development. That one actually came true, and unfortunately the return was sucked. But either way, it was a ridiculous demand at the time. And I demanded that 2-ply toilet paper be put in all public washrooms. My demands were stupid, but they were no more dumb than those of the squatters. Now, the squatters claimed their tents were a form of expression, thus they were protected by the charter. Well, I claimed my truck was my form of expression. So, of course, before long, bylaw officers approached and asked me to move. I politely refused and explained I was exercising my charter rights, and I wouldn't move till my demands were met. Needless to say, they were flummoxed. So soon, more senior officers approached and told me I was breaking a bylaw by parking in the park. They asked if I could park on the street. I said, sure, as soon as you make all those squatters in the tents move to a campground, and then roll up my window. Eventually, the bylaw officers turned into police officers. My truck was surrounded by annoyed squatters, along with frustrated police and bylaw officers, and the press was building up as well. So this standoff lasted for a few hours. Mayor Nenshi and City Hall were stuck with two choices. They could have me removed and prove themselves as hypocrites, or leave me there and let the gong show become worse in this park. So eventually Nenshi made his choice. The police came by and I was informed that a tow truck was coming. I would have to leave my truck when it got there and I was going to be fined. I asked what would happen if I refused to leave my truck. They told me I'd be physically removed and charged with criminal obstruction. I told them that won't be needed. I'm going to leave willingly when the tow truck got there. I'd made my point. No need to make them wrestle me out. I'm not going to be like one of those crazy lefty protesters and make them drag me out of there. So the tow truck had arrived. I left my truck and was issued with $400 in fines. I got those knocked down to $100 later on, by the way. So the headlines the day after were fantastic. The Calgary Sun cover said in big bold print, "Stupefy Calgary." Oh, it was beautiful. And inside there was a big 2-page spread that's with a big headline that said "Hypocrites." And the mayor and City Hall had no excuses left. So that Monday, they sought an injunction and the squatters were removed within a week. Now, what Nenshi said was impossible on Friday was accomplished the following Monday, only because of the protest. I'm going to pat my own back a bit there, take some credit. Protests can make a difference, but you see, they got to be targeted and they have to have a goal. That's the difference between what I did and some other protests. I mean, I was prepared to spend no more than 24 hours out there. I wasn't going to entrench myself for a long time. When protests go awry, it's when they settle in and there isn't a reasonably negotiated end to them. You've got to have terms that can be met. And that was the case with the squatters and arguably later on with the Ottawa protests later. I mean, the Ottawa protests demanded the end of vaccine mandates, but they're also confused through some side demands by a minority. But they all the same, they're demanding the prime minister step down and some other unreasonable demands. Now, as soon as the demands get unreasonable, the protest becomes untenable. I still completely oppose the imposition of the Emergencies Act and the treatment of the truckers' convoy protesters. I mean, the Occupy squatters stayed for months, while the Ottawa protesters were removed in a couple of weeks. So you can't compare those two protests. Still, there's things to be learned. If one wants to hold an effective demonstration, there has to be a way out at the end. There has to be reasonably negotiable terms, and there has to be somebody who can speak on behalf of the protest. I mean, saying it's decentralized is a good idea, but in the end, it makes it very difficult because you get different messaging and you get things from all over. And it's all easier said than done, but protests can backfire and actually reduce public support for a cause if they're done wrong. In fact, they often do. Some come out and say, "I don't care what the public thinks." Well, you better. Because it's fine if you don't care, but the politicians do, and they're the ones who will send the police if they feel the public supports that approach. And the right to protest, I mean, it's essential in democracy, integral. We can't allow it to be eroded. And that's what we're getting worried about with the whole Jagmeet Singh thing last week, where they're trying to talk about cracking down on expression. Hey, the approach to Singh was tasteless and nasty. That just comes with the turf. It sucks, but I don't think it was a good idea to go out and do it. It doesn't help public support, but they have every right to do it. Protesting, though, has to be done with care and planning. Impulse demonstrations that last a day or so are fine. But when things entrench, you'd better have a plan. So we might have more restrictions come from the government in the future. They love control, and they've proven they like to exercise it. And in that case, the citizens are going to need to protest again. We're not done. So let's learn from past protests. We can be successful with them, but you have to do them right.